Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to and joining into the Green Nurse podcast. We have such an exceptional topic today. We have to talk about this. It's actually been on our radar for probably, what would we say, like a year,
I would say
over
a year now,
maybe
yeah.
maybe even longer. And we'd be remiss if we did not talk about this case. It means a lot to us. And I think this is now just the perfect time to have this conversation and this discussion. So before I get into it, of course, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to tell you who we have as a guest and what we're talking about today. Sarah, take it away.
Actually, it's been really great that we found this guest because she has a lot of thoughts and opinions on the case we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Amanda Golino, who is a critical care clinical nurse specialist who's been practicing as a nurse for 16 years. Her expertise is in adult critical care. She has worked in both trauma and medical ICUs and has published numerous nursing research studies on topics such as non-pharmacologic pain management, as well as opinion pieces on racism in nursing and the FDA ban on MSM blood donors. Welcome, Amanda. We're so glad to have you today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here and talk about this.
So we were just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about yourself and your background in nursing.
Sure. So my background is all ICU. So I started out as a new grad in a trauma ICU and worked there for about 3 years and then transferred to a med-surg ICU for about close to 5 years. And then after that, I became a clinical nurse specialist, and I've been doing that since about 2014.
Yeah, that's amazing. And again, it's always good to have people who work in the field in this area to have this conversation with. And I think that the next thing that we kind of want to get into and have a better understanding about is the case with DonQuenick. So could you tell us a little bit about how you became involved in the case and who DonQuenick actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I became knowledgeable about this case. It was probably almost a year ago. So I want to say maybe April or May of 2022. And I first heard about this case on Nurse Twitter, which is where I get a lot of really good information and hear kind of a lot of different things about the pulse, I guess you could say, of nursing. Some nurse colleagues of mine had first shared the Denver Post article about DonQuenick, and that was really the first time I had heard about it. So primarily on Nurse Twitter, I didn't really hear about it in any of the other venues where I get a lot of information. And it was sort of in the backdrop of one of the other big cases that people were really talking about, which was Radonda. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about her because I think that case was talked about pretty extensively last year. But certainly as a comparison between the two, the attention that case received versus this case is very interesting to talk about. And I definitely have some thoughts about that. But for this case, I first heard about it through some nursing advocates that I talk to fairly regularly. And just the details about the case really shook me and really made me think about a lot of things that we all encounter in nursing and some of the kind of hard truths that we haven't really faced as a profession. And so that's kind of really where I first heard about it. And the thread that I made in that May of last year was me trying to pull all the different info about the case into one spot.
Yeah, I think that's good that that you're so connected to this case because, like you said, there was so much more attention paid to Radonda that even when I was doing research for this episode, I found very few articles compared to like what you would find if you did a search on Radonda. So it just, I think we can get more into it as we go through the episode. But again, it just highlights the differences that you will see when it comes to, you know, comparing one nurse to another. And I think that it's also really important because it's happening at a really critical time in nursing where nursing is in the spotlight right now for a lot of times negative news. And I don't want this to be a negative episode, but it's really sad what has happened to Dawn. And maybe we can kind of go through the specifics of this case. I did pull up that Denver Post article, and maybe I can read it out and you can sort of insert any other thoughts that you have on this. But basically, DonQuenick Joppy, she was charged in 2020 with manslaughter, negligent death of an at-risk person, and neglect of an at-risk person in the death of a 94-year-old patient in intensive care at the medical center of Aurora. These charges came more than a year after she was fired over the same patient's death. And according to the lawsuit, it claims that the hospital's investigation into this man's death was racially biased. This man died on May 24, 2019, after coming to the hospital with evidence of septic shock and multi-organ failure, and he was put on a ventilator before the man's family decided to move him to the ICU for palliative care. He came into DonQuenick's care toward the end of her overnight shift on a day when the ICU was understaffed, and she actually stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift, which ended at 7 a.m. to care for the man. Around 8 a.m., a doctor gave a verbal order for end-of-life measures to another nurse, who then delegated the order to Joppy, according to the lawsuit. So she called a respiratory therapist and followed his instructions to turn off the ventilator. Then it goes on to say the patient died, and his death certificate says he died of natural causes and specifically septic shock. So it looks like DonQuenick acted on a verbal and not a documented order to carry out this intervention. Joppy has yet to recover from the ordeal. So I'm just going to pause here, and maybe, Amanda, you can kind of insert your thoughts, or if I've missed anything into this conversation.
Yeah, the Denver Post article has probably the most accurate overview of the case. You can obtain the full lawsuit, which is a federal EEOC lawsuit in the Colorado courts. So if anybody who's listening to this really wants to kind of go deeper, it's about 20 pages, so it's pretty lengthy. But everything that I'm sharing today is all information that's out there on the internet. It's just that, folks haven't really obviously had the time to look through it all and have it all in one place. And so that's why this is a really great venue for folks to hear more about it. I think, what's really important to understand, and if you read the lawsuit, you kind of get a better sense of like what kind of work environment this was. So this all happened before COVID. So it was 2019. DonQuenick was an ICU nurse. And when you read about her as a person, as a nurse, she was someone who had received lots of accolades, received, positive comments from patients that she provided really good patient care. She's what you would call a nurse's nurse, like was really in there taking care of her patients and really found a lot of enjoyment out of providing that basic nursing care that people really need. And she had been nominated 3 times for Daisy Awards. So, typically people who get nominated for Daisy Awards are people who, patients or families remember for something really special. At the time that she worked in this ICU, she only worked there for about 2 years. So in that time frame, she had received these 3 Daisy nominations. She also had a performance evaluation, just one during that time frame that, didn't say a whole lot, but said that she was obviously qualified and doing her job. And then another thing that she had done was she was a nurse who was out there in her community, and she was teaching people CPR. So a local news station actually did a story about how she was out teaching CPR. And I think they called it like a Heart Saver Award or something like that. So this was someone who, was definitely a pillar of the community, who was a really good nurse. There isn't really anything negative reported about her performance. In the lawsuit, it really helps explain the unit culture that, she was working under, because there's numerous instances when she was in this ICU talking about different things that happened to her. And they all seem to be, if not overt racism, I guess you could say covert racism. She alleges that she was accused of theft by a patient that was completely unfounded. But while that was being investigated, she was restricted from using the nursing staff lounge during that time. Yeah, it was something like an accusation about stealing a patient's credit card to buy a stethoscope, which sounds pretty bizarre. And it was unfounded. There was another incident where she was trying to go to some like additional training. I believe it was for like cardiac specific things in ICU. Like there's different types of training that people have, or different skill sets. And she was denied that, and it was said to her something like she didn't have good organizational skills. So that was another incident that occurred. I'm not really able to visualize what the unit layout was, but something to the effect of that she was regularly isolated from her peers and put in like a different part of the ICU where it was really difficult to get other coworkers to help her. So she was kind of, stuck in that part of the unit where, and I don't know what other folks' background is, but generally, if you're working in an ICU or an ER, you really need to have good teamwork to be successful. You can't really reposition dependent patients easily by yourself. Just when patients are crashing and things like that, it takes a team. So if you have a unit culture where people are kind of isolating you off into different sections, that makes that unit, not a very positive place to work. But those are just, kind of some of the background, which I think kind of makes sense as to what leads into this event of this patient's death. So it was around 2 years that she worked there, and this happened, I think, in May, and she was terminated in June. And this patient that came in, it's my understanding he was a DNR coming in. But, sometimes when patients come in, families will, call 911 or what have you, they'll get brought in, and then there's a rapid change in the code status. So everything gets done initially, and then there's a discussion with the family like, hey, is this what you really, want to do? The patient's not doing well. And then there was a rapid de-escalation in care. So I don't know, what a lot of your viewers or listeners are familiar with, but that's fairly common that someone will kind of get everything in the kitchen sink initially, and then that care will get rapidly de-escalated if a family says, hey, we want to stop. This is not what we wanted. It talks about in the lawsuit how, the doctor talked to the family and the family was like, this is not what we want for our loved one. We don't want, the ventilator, all the vasopressors, all these things for septic shock. This isn't what the patient would have wanted, and we would like to transition to comfort care. So that's all very routine things that happen, whether it's the ER, the medical surgical unit, the ICU. People will change from aggressive care to comfort care. So it's kind of odd to me that, like, if you hear other nurses talking about that, sometimes you'll hear other nurses saying, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe they just withdrew care on this patient. And that happens very frequently, at least in my experience. I don't know about you all's, but, working in the ICU, we have that abrupt change. I think what kind of got maybe messy in this case was it was night shift into day shift. It talks about there being, the unit was short staffed. And it sounds like DonQuenick had this patient coming up from the ER to the ICU, and then she stayed to kind of help the day shift as they took over, which again, that happens pretty often. That's just like a nice thing to do for the next shift, kind of help them with kind of getting things settled. So I think that's kind of where maybe the chaos of the situation occurred, is that the patient was getting everything. Then the patient's family said, no, we want to stop. So how that became a manslaughter charge is very bizarre again. But the nurse who was taking care of the patient during the day was putting in the verbal orders from the doctor saying, we're going to stop the vasopressors. We're going to stop the ventilator. We're going to transition the patient to comfort. I believe there was some orders for like Versed or something else for comfort. That's, again, pretty standard. And so all of the aggressive measures were stopped. The patient passed away. And then there was some back and forth between the nurse, DonQuenick, who was helping, the respiratory therapist, as far as like who's going to do what. And so I think that's maybe where the confusion was. But for that to become a manslaughter charge, to me, is a little strange. And it doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't know about the background of how toxic this environment was that DonQuenick was working in. And then when you hear that, it makes a little more sense, because it sounds like her coworkers reported this as a suspicious death that she was involved in, but really there wasn't anything suspicious about it. If you read in the lawsuit, the family actually said that they thought DonQuenick provided great care to their loved one. She was there helping him as he passed away with the family. So there really wasn't anything untoward, but it became something that was investigated after the fact and led to termination.
Yeah, it sounds to me like there's a lot of different things that we need to kind of touch on and kind of
Mm-hmm.
unpack in terms of that situation. The first thing I would think of is it's kind of almost like no good deed goes unpunished, right?
Right.
Like we as nurses tend to want to help other shifts. So it's like, okay, we know you're short staff. Her staying additionally was a good deed,
Yep.
and now it was like a punishable deed. The other piece is, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about it, and I'd love to hear your take as well as kind of what the politics are out there in terms of verbal orders. But here, it's kind of the same sense where it happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We get verbal orders from physicians. They might not be on site or they might not be on the unit in that particular time when we're calling them for an order, but we're always told. And I think, and I'd love to hear kind of from the U.S. perspective, what's your standing on verbal orders as well, where we're pretty much told that we shouldn't take verbal orders. But again, it's a part of the business of healthcare where we get verbal orders all the time. And again, depending on your comfort level, your experience, how you've worked with these practitioners before, whether it's a physician or whomever, it'll be dependent on how you go about, working with that verbal order.
Yep.
From my understanding, from the CNO, so the College of Nurses of Ontario here in Canada, we're not supposed to take verbal orders. So it happens all the time, but we're not supposed to take them. Or if a verbal order comes in, we need to make sure that that document is signed off.
Right.
I don't know about your experience, Sarah, but I remember when I worked in labor and delivery, and whenever we got a verbal order, I was probably that bitchy nurse that was like, yeah, I'll wait till you show up, write this down, sign it off before I actually enact anything. And again, that's where that whole like no good deed goes unpunished, because it is a part of the business. There are no structures put in place to prevent this from occurring because we know it happens all the time. And then again, when you're trying to help out as a member of the team, now you're being punished for an action that tends to be normalized within the healthcare system.
Yeah, and I think there's what's supposed to happen on paper versus what happens in real
reality.
life.
Yeah.
So many times I've been in emergency situations where there's an emergency verbal order given over the phone. And then the minute the physician walks into the unit, like if you're on paper charting, you're there like, hey, sign this before you come on, or like get to this computer and sign it off. But, that's not always reality. So I guess like we're just wondering your thoughts on this whole verbal order versus documented order situation.
Yeah, I think I would agree with both of you. It's one of those things where, so in my experience, I've been using like Epic, for example, as a platform for a long time. And when there was kind of like the initial changeover, it was like the rule is no more verbal orders. Everything needs to get entered by the provider. And the only exceptions are, in an emergency, or if they're tied up, if they're like in surgery or driving or something like that. And I think that's probably the rule in most places. I can't speak to this organization because I don't work there. But to your point, the actual practice of that is very, very different in reality. And I think, particularly in the ER and the ICU, when there's rapid patient changes and lots of things happening with folks, maybe not, coding in an official capacity, but when someone's on high dose vasopressors, like this patient was, they're kind of getting a chemical code because they're, basically dependent on those vasopressors to have a pulse and a blood pressure. And if they were to stop or run out of the bag, they would probably code. So they're pretty sick. They're pretty unstable. There's probably a lot of different orders and things flying around. So theoretically, yes, should you always wait to have that order in the chart? Sure. But, if you had a family sitting there in front of you and they were like, please stop, he doesn't want this, we want to let him go, that the doctor had the conversation and the family has said to stop, you do kind of walk that line also of it becoming assault. Because when a family says stop, we also have to stop very abruptly. And that can be tough when you don't have, everything wrapped up in a nice bow like you should. And so I do think in healthcare, we kind of set people up for failure because, yeah, on paper, everybody's supposed to have all these things in place. And sometimes, life happens and our work environments are so chaotic. So, it sounds like this was a chaotic shift. It was happening at the change of shift, which is never good. I think, if you wanted to argue, like, yes, should you always wait? I think that argument could be made. But what it sounds like is that everyone knew this patient's family wanted to withdraw care. The patient was really very tenuous and barely, there as a overall, he immediately passed away when they turned everything off. So that, he was a very, very sick person. So it just doesn't sound like any kind of anything nefarious that was going on, or, an intentional, anything malicious. If you wanted to kind of focus in on the orders being an issue, that could be the case. But it doesn't really make sense either that DonQuenick would have been the focus when she wasn't even the primary nurse at that point. That was,
100%. And I think there's a couple other things to dig into, right? Like the whole treatment or mistreatment, I should say, of DonQuenick by her peers. Like it
right.
sounded to me like your classic textbook nursing bullying. And then what made it 10 times worse probably were those added assaults of racist harm or racist abuse.
Yep.
And I think to myself, this is a conversation that nursing needs to have within its profession. Like it's a huge problem. Mm-hmm. Just the bullying alone is a huge problem, but the racism is this added element that we don't even talk about very much, and we should, because again, we talk about social determinants of health. We within working in our workplaces can still be affected, and our determinants can be affected as well. And we're talking about the social determinant health of racism and how that impacts the way you go about doing your daily work and the things that you have to do to care for a patient and a client. And then again, just feeling that I could only imagine, because I remember my own instances of bullying going into an environment every time or a shift where I actually do remember that I'm saying that even some of her nursing ratios were off too. Like
yep.
the ratios are supposed to be, one, I think it was like 1-to-1 or maybe 2-to-1. And I was seeing that she was getting like maybe 2 or 3 patients in an ICU, which is not typical. And then again, being isolated, I remember that happening to me where essentially, there was the team over there and I was, put into a far room away from everybody. And again, that creates animosity, and no, I shouldn't say animosity, but that creates that tension where that you're not being supported within that work field. And so I feel like there was a lot of different things at play, and I kind of feel like the staff didn't support her because it did sound like it was the staff who ended up reporting her at the end of the day. And again, this manslaughter charge, like you said, makes absolutely no sense. I don't understand where it's coming from. And again, I just think that there are greater factors and greater things at play.
I find this all very strange because the fact is the family was happy with the care that he received. So this lawsuit didn't even come from the family, but yet it's been pushed forward and it's actually gone all the way through. And it just seems to me like such a waste of resources when we have so many other issues in healthcare that we're actually, we're wasting resources on this case where the family, like in this case, the nurse actually did what the family wanted and is still suffering the consequences.
Yeah, wasting time and also destroying her life. Like, what is happening with DonQuenick right now?
Yeah, so those are all really good points. One thing I wanted to mention just before I talk about what's going on now is in the mix of all of this. So this happened, I think, in May. A lot of folks have said, well, if the unit was so terrible, if it was so awful, why didn't she leave? Well, she actually did try to leave. Even if she hadn't, I don't know that would have mattered. But I think she actually tried to go into the float pool I think it was that March of 2019. So a couple months before this happened. And when she tried to transfer out of this unit to the float pool, then all of a sudden she was put on a performance improvement plan. And that was the only time that she had been put on this performance improvement plan. A lot of people call them PIPs. And basically, that's usually for some kind of disciplinary reason. But in her case, this was really the first time, she had been put on a PIP. Didn't really specify why. There weren't any concerns about her performance. And because of being put on that PIP, then she couldn't leave and go to the float pool either. So she was kind of stuck, in this kind of toxic culture on top of not being able to transfer out. And that was only 2 months before this incident. So I think it kind of helps to understand that background, of all these different things that were going on, because otherwise on the surface, it doesn't make sense either way. But then when you hear that, you're like, okay, there was just a lot there. And that bullying, all that different dynamics that were happening. As far as now, so this happened in 2019 when DonQuenick was fired, and I think it was June. Around the same time, the charges were filed. So now it's 2023. Her lawsuit for against the workplace was filed last year, so it's been about a year. I'm not super familiar with like how long lawsuits take when they go through the federal system, but suffice to say, it's still undergoing, it's still underway. So it's been kind of a slow process, but she has been in court and has had to go under depositions. So, getting sworn in and speaking about her experiences. And then there's also been other interviews of other folks who are involved in the case. So her case is still underway. It's been a long time, almost 4 years since the original events occurred. And I think what really stands out to me is this happened in 2019, and then in 2020 is when COVID hit that spring. During that time, she hasn't worked since this occurred. And that's another question people will ask. Well, why doesn't she just go get another job? Because the charges were dismissed against her. But if you've ever had, I would imagine, manslaughter charges against you as a nurse, that would kind of make it difficult for you to get another job. I haven't applied for a job recently, but I would think if anyone does any kind of background check and pulls your name, they're going to come across that, whether it was dismissed or not. And then the other thing that's been asked is, like, does she still have a nursing license? And the answer is yes, she still has a valid Colorado nursing license.
Yeah, I mean, again, all those points that you made are valid. I just want to circle back to like one particular point where you mentioned, the whole mentality of why doesn't she leave? And again, this is where I kind of think about, aspects of racism, where it's like, if you don't like it here, why don't you leave? Well, again, at the end of the day, if the problem isn't the individual and it's the system that needs to be fixed. And it shouldn't be that the person has to leave. It should be that they're looking at a bigger problem here and they should be dealing with that. So I just wanted to throw that in. But the other piece, like you mentioned, is the whole fact that even with her did you say that the manslaughter, it has been dropped?
Yes. So those charges were dropped. I'm not 100% sure what year that was, because the charges were pressed in middle of 2019, and they were ultimately dropped in the interest of justice. So that's a pretty strong statement.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of sounds like as quickly as it came about was as quickly as it was let go. And I don't have all the details about why, the DA or whoever, took it forward. They didn't really go into super great depths about why, but just the fact that it was stated that was in the interest of justice, to me, kind of is like a mic drop right there. Like,
Yeah, that's crazy.
dropped.
So like so what is happening with her right now? One of the things I did see is that like she's almost on the brink of houselessness, which is horrifying. I mean, I guess this is an event that would precipitate a situation in which, she's having difficulty recovering from. I think anybody would have difficulty recovering from this situation. So what is she doing now? Is she, like, I know you said she's not able to work, but how can we support? What are some things that we can do, or what exactly is happening?
Yeah, so she has in the last couple of years had experiences being unhoused. So she has had periods of time where she's been homeless. She currently does have a safe place to stay. To your point, she has not been able to work, and I think obviously, I'm a white woman, so I've never experienced this level of racism and bullying. But I think, if you really read through the things that she was experiencing on this unit, she has a lot of trauma from the events, and then not only what happened, but then being charged with a crime you didn't commit. At one point there was an investigation into her license, which has, since concluded, and she still has it. But, not being able to work, losing, her livelihood, her, family for that time frame, being unhoused. It's just been a really difficult couple of years. And the thing that I think about being an ICU nurse is how badly we needed someone like her at the bedside during COVID, and we didn't
Right.
have her. And it's not because of, like in some of these other cases, everyone's kind of rallied against the system, but in this case, it was us, and
Right.
particularly people, unfortunately, who look like me that really perpetrated this violence against her. And I think that's why there's probably hesitation in folks speaking about this case, because it kind of
Mm.
forces people to look in the mirror, and not everyone's ready, unfortunately, for that. But it's happening, and it's not fair, and it's not right. We do have a fundraiser currently that we're working on right now. It's to help with her legal fees, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of need for like expert witnesses and different,
Right.
costs involved with a lawsuit of this nature. And she's obviously going up against a large organization that has a lot of resources. She does have, like Venmo and CashApp if folks just wanted to send her some cash to help her with her living expenses and things like that. Really, talking with her and, having met her in this last year or so, I think, another reason that she was targeted is she's just a very different person. And I mean that in a great way. She's very genuine. She's very deeply spiritual, quotes the Bible often, really just a fantastically genuine person. And I hate to say it, but I think that sometimes people target folks just because of their differences. And she
Mm.
certainly is somebody who stands out as an individual, but to me, in a really positive way, as someone who has just this really great character and just is a really, loving, wonderful person. And it just kind of
Right.
makes it
Yeah.
that much worse that this happened to her, because, she's someone that the nursing profession is, we lost out as a profession because of this happening to her and her not being able to go back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so great that you could share all these different aspects of her that we didn't know. And we'd be happy to put in some of those links, to her Venmo or Cash App or whatever fundraiser you've organized. We want to be able to amplify her story and hopefully send some more support her way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to share that. And that would be really appreciated. I think, just as the case continues on, it could be a while longer. So
Mhm.
that would be really great, as a way of helping her out, and, kind of take for folks to take a step forward and do something actionable.
Is there any other like key takeaways or anything else we should touch upon?
Overall, as a nursing profession, it is a profession that's primarily white women. And, I think there's been a lot more being said, particularly about the issues of racism in nursing. Some of the big organizations have come out and had statements, but overall, there really hasn't been a lot of support, particularly for DonQuenick, from the big organizations. And that's something that I would really like to see. And I would like to see, other nurses kind of putting some pressure. Folks put a lot of pressure in some of these other cases for these organizations to come out and really say something and do something. So far, the MedSurg Nurses organization has hosted a couple things about DonQuenick's story, but otherwise, that's really been it. There really hasn't been a lot of other support for her. That's something I would like to see. And I think if you are a member of a nursing organization like ANA or AACN, which is the critical care nurses one, I would say reach out and ask for them to really kind of support a nurse it's one thing to make a statement about racism, but this is a nurse who lost her career because of racism. So how about backing her up and saying this is wrong, that this happened, and we support her. That's something I would like to see.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that part of the conversation we were talking about Radonda Vaught, right? Where we
Mhm.
were mentioning the fact that that case was highly publicized. I think it even got to a point where Radonda had an opportunity to kind of do a tell all and share her side of the story.
Right.
And I don't remember seeing at all that element for DonQuenick. So I think that, or DonQuenick, I should
Mhm.
say, and I think that's very that's telling in itself that her story hasn't been told in the same way that Redonda's story was, and it's very disappointing. And I hope that through this episode,
Mhm.
through continued conversations, if we can amplify it, that we can maybe get some more attention to it, because I think that's an important thing to do. And then again, shine a light into those dark areas where racism is occurring within healthcare and within nursing as a profession.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Amanda, for coming on. We really enjoyed this conversation. I'm so glad that DonQuenick has you as an advocate. We are standing behind her as well, and we will definitely continue to amplify her story and hope that things improve for her.
Yeah, are there any links or any Twitter handles or Instagram things that people can follow up on this story, or follow up with you, or Don Quinique herself in relation to what's happening?
Yeah, some of the hashtags that we use kind of in support of DonQuenick are I stand with DonQuenick, racism in nursing, which, we're using it in this case, but of course it's pertinent to other situations as well. And Justice for DQ. She goes by DQ sometimes. So those are some of the different ones you might see if you go look on Nurse Twitter. There is also a Facebook group called Support for DonQuenick that I created. We have about 600 people in that right now, and I will regularly share information, if there's new articles or things like that. And there's also an Instagram account called Racism in Nursing, which features DonQuenick's story as well as, some other cases that are out there. So those are a couple different ways to get more info.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us, and I hope that our guests take an opportunity to look at all the links. We'll put them in our show notes. And thank you for sharing her story with us, and we hope to share it with some other folks and get this story amplified. Thanks so much for coming on, Amanda.
Thank you for having me.